I don't know about you, but this is starting to get a little old. OpenAI has been saying they're ahead. These models are still making basic mistakes.
Especially some of these Chinese companies have come up with a way of reproducing some of these models that the proprietary companies are actually using. Hey Matt, how you doing?
Sam, I'm doing good. It's a little cold here, so I got my jacket on. It's six in the morning, but I wanted to wake up so I could talk with you because you're in Singapore. How's it going on over there?
It's definitely not cold here. I think it's sort of like, nice balmy 80 plus degrees outside at the moment.
Well, you're in Singapore, you're in Asia, and that's one of the first topics we were going to talk about today, which is the rise of the open source models from China to challenge the OpenAI O1 preview. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so DeepSeek, one of the companies out of China, basically dropped this model called R1, and this is kind of their attempt at at sort of a reasoning model. I guess you would sort of talk about it. I've had a play with it. It's a very impressive model. It's definitely sort of on track with the O1, the O1 preview models that OpenAI has released. And then since even then, we've seen other labs in China also release models like this. So I think the really big theme here is not just these models. Like these models definitely are really good. The really interesting thing with the DeepSeek one is that they're saying that they're going to open source the weights or do an open release of the weights. Uh, you know, Over the next sort of week or two, we're hoping that we're going to see the weights and get to play with it. But I think the really big interesting theme here is just how open source is catching up with the proprietary models. And so I think it's what the start of September that OpenAI released the O1 models. We're waiting for the full O1. So currently we only have the O1 mini and the O1 preview. Supposedly, perhaps after Thanksgiving, they're going to release the actual O1 model. And it's going to be interesting to see, like, does that suddenly propel them ahead even more? Or are we at this point now where some of these, especially some of these Chinese companies have come up with a way of reproducing some of these models that the proprietary companies are actually using? So I do think this is a huge sort of step forward, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
It's fascinating that DeepSeek, I think a quant kind of hedge fund company from China that has been around for a while, but because of their expertise in artificial intelligence, they have. I think they're one of several companies that have 10,000 GPUs in a cluster and able to do some of this stuff. But OpenAI has been saying they're ahead, right? Sam Altman has this way of kind of appealing to the fact that they're going for AGI in a podcast. Was it yesterday, day before, referring to they're going to hit it in 2025. And for me, I don't know about you, but this is starting to get a little old, right? Where I think they had this big leadership, and it was really demonstrated, right? Last year, where they had the leadership with their 3 and 4, and then 4.0. But that lead is just no longer there. So clearly skeptic. If they were clearly ahead, they should be able to demonstrate this. And I'm wondering, when it comes to the development, what does it actually mean for developing applications, I guess, right? Because I think that we've talked already about the model having too much share of the glory, and how, remember, we talked last week about Agentic AI showing that the value is moving away from the model. What does that mean for a developer on your side? And why are you still excited about kind of this LLM versus that LLM?
I kind of feel that, okay, you're totally right that as the models get better as a whole, the model that you put, the things and the skills that you need the model to do, almost all the models can do them now. So one of the really interesting models that came out this week also from Allen AI is actually a full open source model. So what's the difference here? So an fully open source release means that they not only give you the model weights, they're giving you the training code, they're giving you the data set, they're giving you sort of all the settings that they used so that you could reproduce it. Now, you could imagine that a lot of organizations are going to really like that because they can then sort of see what was in that data set and see, okay, was there anything that was, copyrighted material? Was there anything that's going to conflict with their company's, sort of stance on things like that. So that's actually called the Olmo 2 model, right? So this is actually a proper open source release. These other releases that we're talking about generally are fitting into the category of open weights releases, where we're getting the model, but we're not getting the training data. We're not getting sort of the scripts of how they actually trained it, that kind of thing. Okay, what we've got coming out of China, open weights models. People can use these models. Most of these models are very well licensed. So it's going to be very interesting to see when the DeepSeek R1 comes out, what is the license for that? Will companies just be able to go and use it straight away, and then be able to get good results? The other thing too is that will they be able to fine tune it for their particular use cases? We don't know yet exactly how they're doing it, how they're doing what's called test time compute going on here. So we should stress that the difference between these models and what you were talking about before, the GPT-3, GPT-4 models, is that these models spend a lot more compute when they're actually doing the inference. So the previous sort of series of models would spend a lot of compute only when they were doing the training. And then once the training was done, you would use a much smaller amount and more consistent amount of compute. Whereas these reasoning models are using a lot more compute and they can sort of iterate on themselves. Hence why people sort of refer to these as reasoning models, in that they can kind of sort of propose something, perhaps sort of think about it. And when I say think, I'm doing inverted commas. Think about it, come back around on it, and refine their answer over time. And this is often why they do better. So they've got long chains of thought, as we call them here.
What I found fascinating about the DeepSeek release was that we saw some examples of how there were some developers testing this, and it went through that example of counting the number of R's in the strawberry. And I found it fascinating where you could see the logic, you could see its reasoning, and it was surprised. I don't know if you remember seeing this, but it was surprised, when it was counting the number of R's. But wait, there's another one hidden in there somewhere, and it would go around 2 or 3 times. It was fascinating to see that. And what it allows you to do that you can't do with OpenAI's O1, right? And I think OpenAI said this, they didn't want to release all that chain of thought reasoning in there for the user to see, partly maybe out of competitive reasons, but I think they also talked about not wanting to show a misalignment. Um, but by showing this, it allows you to see where the model goes wrong sometimes, right? If it makes a mistake, and so then you can reprompt, and you as a developer and as a user could figure out where to take it and improve it. I thought that was a remarkable addition. So the fact that the Chinese are out there in front, it really is remarkable, right? With probably less cluster size, but are they? To what extent is this an apples to apples? I think there's some folks who are saying, there's a number of tricks you can use, right? The number of tokens you're using, the amount of compute obviously play into that. Thinking longer at test time, inference. But here's something. I was talking with Steve Jones, executive VP for Gen AI at Capgemini, right? They work with a lot of enterprise companies to use Gen AI. And he was saying, hey, he'd take an agentic framework anytime, right? LangGraph mixed with some planning and execution frameworks. From his experience, this is going to beat an O1 preview or any one of these models easily. Just wondering what your experience is.
Yeah, definitely. So when O1 came out, I actually did sort of a poor man's O1 sort of test, right, of creating some of these models myself. And I created one version that was an agentic one, and version that was just a small model, and that I trained to be similar like it, or fine tuned and did some alignment to be like it. The thing that I found is definitely the agentic way is safer, because you can actually have sort of checks and balances and stuff like that in there. You can have verifiers in there, that kind of thing. Um, that said, though, like if you've got that plus one of these models like R1, you've kind of got the best of both worlds. You mentioned the whole sort of counting R's in strawberries. One of the first tests that I gave the R1 was, okay, count the number of R's in strawberry when I spell it wrong with 4 R's. And sure enough, it was able to look at it and work out that there were 4 R's in there. So for me, that was impressive, that it's not just been overfit to do well on this, on certain tests or something like that. It is definitely out there.
I want to throw out some names in news, and want to hear from you which one you think is the most relevant to comment on briefly. Just, the Fireworks AI, I think it was November 18th, released this compound AI model specialized in complex reasoning, right? It wasn't benchmarked against the O1 preview, but it was focused on beating 4.0, it looked like. So that was one development, right? So that's, I think, a San Francisco-based company. And then you have we haven't talked about Alibaba and OpenMMLab, which I think is invested in by Shanghai AI Lab, which is a big player in China. So those two apparently released models that were comparable to the O1 preview. Have you looked at any of those three? Does anything jump out at you for our listeners in terms of what they should
I've had a
take
quick
away?
look at it. I've had a quick look at the Chinese ones. They all look interesting. Another one that you could add to that list would be the Noose Forge. Again, a San Francisco-based startup that's been doing a lot of things around fine tuning, has sort of built a reputation around fine tuning the llama models and stuff like that. From what I understand, their approach is much more agentic for doing this kind of thing, and you can swap out any model. So, that sort of gives them an advantage, is that their system is not necessarily built around one model. If they can sort of take whatever the, model of the day is, and then incorporate that, that's got to be a sort of win as well for this. I think all of these, are going to be sort of in a similar direction, right? We've seen that, like, okay, there's enough knowledge out there now that people are sort of working out how to do at least some of these ideas from OpenAI. Now, maybe we haven't got the whole sort of secret sauce that OpenAI has got, and maybe they've got, some more interesting stuff to come. Like I mentioned earlier on, we haven't seen O1 itself. So if O1 comes out and it's substantially better than this, that's going to be really interesting. But it also might take substantially longer to do the reasoning. So I think what they're going for there is much more sort of a model that is not going to be used for your sort of standard business uses. It's going to be for the scientific discoveries, the sort of, finding a cure to cancer, that kind of stuff. And you could imagine for that, we don't mind waiting for the model to think for a week if it's going to come out with something sort of profound and amazingly new. The big question is just, is it going to do that or not? That's the key thing. So I do think that the sort of agentic frameworks, the next thing we're going to talk about, I guess, is sort of adds to that. The Anthropic has released this week some really interesting things around that. And we can sort of see that, okay, the agentic frameworks give things in a way that enterprise perhaps likes a bit better, because it's safer. You can do all these checks along the way. You can see very clearly when your system's going wrong. You can start to do evals to fix it, that kind of thing. So Anthropic has been announcing so many things so quickly. What I'm interested in is something that they announced early in the week called the Model Context Protocol. So this is really interesting, Matt. This is like where we saw last year OpenAI tried to make ChatGPT plugins. It didn't work. It kind of failed. They kind of ended up having to roll it back, etc. This is an attempt at something similar, But Anthropic's basically saying, okay, we're just going to put this protocol out and make it open source. So, yes, it will work with our models from day one, but any other model, including all these Chinese models, including Llama, will be able to support this. And it's definitely an interesting thing of where now you can sort of make tools which can be just integrated into the Anthropic Claude platform, and that exact same tool will be able to be used in other platforms as well. So I think this is something that's really fascinating.
You've seen, these decade-long, shifts where, you have uh, these open formats like, Iceberg and Delta, right? It took forever for the industry to change, over to those. So if it took so long for the Microsofts to kind of slowly, in the Databricks and the Snowflake and others, finally beginning to kind of mobilize around, but it's still not completely aligned. So when it comes to this context, protocol, can you talk a little bit about how compelling that is for someone like you? How effective is that going to be?
So I do think it's interesting, right? And I totally get why you're skeptical, and I totally get, every time, there are 13 standards and someone wants to introduce a new one, you end up with just 14 standards. um that I the thing here, I guess, is that one, you've got Anthropic, which really has the model that everyone's kind of using for coding, right? So that Sonnet 3.5 is one of the key models for coding that people are using, that people like Cursor are using, that a lot of other sort of pieces of software out there using. The second thing is that because they've kind of made this just like an open standard, so anyone can kind of use it, and that they're basically saying, look, here it is. They've given it, they've put out an SDK both in TypeScript for JavaScript developers and in Python for Python developers. One of the challenges, for a lot of these things up until now has been that they've only supported Python, which meant that, you're missing out on a lot of the AI engineers who just have never really used Python. They're front end coders, that kind of thing. So Anthropic's been really smart to make that, a sort of default from day zero, with this. And their examples are in, TypeScript. And you can see that it's very easy to integrate these things. So suddenly now you can give the Claude models search. You can give it access to be able to just say, hey, take that, take that list of headlines that I got you to get, and just save it in a file on my local drive. Currently, all of these things are running locally on your computer. So that actually kind of, sort of, I think, builds some trust that people can see exactly what's going on where, there's no sort of having to worry about, hang on a minute, where's my data going to, what's going on in the background that I'm not sort of seeing. Of course, your data is still going to Anthropic. That's one of the key things, but you can see everything else on your computer quite easily. I think it's going to be really interesting. I think a lot of the open source people will get behind it because I think it sort of just unifies this whole area of function calling where a lot of the providers have had their own way of doing it. So OpenAI was the first one to do it. They came up with a standard. Uh, Other companies went and did their own way. Then you had companies like Olama trying to support their own standard for open models. Then there were a lot of open models that weren't really trained for it, but people fine-tuned for it. You could see that with this new sort of protocol, if everyone gets behind it, it's not only going to be good for Anthropic, it's going to be good for a lot of the open source models. Is that they will be able to say, right, any tool that was created for Anthropic, well, you can just use that on our models as well.
You said it's all going to go back to Anthropic. Anthropic, has a view on all of the stuff. Can you talk a little bit about what that means? Because of course, Anthropic has a massive investment from AWS. Some people are speculating that the AWS from Amazon is going to acquire it at some point, because it's going to be hard for Anthropic to have an independent business model. Why do you think people are going to bet on that if say AWS has a leg up on the data and what's happening there?
So the protocol will only send stuff to Anthropic if you're using the Anthropic model. If you're using it with another model or something like that, they're not going to be able to see your data. So in many ways, it's the same as what you've already got if you choose to use the Claude models today. It's just that you've got like suddenly you've got search, suddenly you've got things like I hooked up sort of three tools. One being search, one being a thing called Puppeteer, which can sort of go to websites and stuff like that, and one being a file system thing. I asked it very quickly, hey, go to the VentureBeat site and look at all the headlines that are about Anthropic and bring it back to me. And sure enough, it went to your site. It looked at this. It came back with like four, headlines that said, well, okay, these are about Anthropic. And then I was able to just say, okay, now save those to a text file, and it just saved them. So you can see that that's like a really tiny little example. But imagine suddenly now if you can get this thing to be more like an agent where you can say, okay, go out and compare 6 articles about Anthropic, work out what the best things are, and then make me a report, and then at the end we'll save that report. Or make me a set of a slide deck, and then we'll save that slide deck. So I think this is really opening up the sort of opportunity where people will be able to use this for agents, right? Their own personal agents. And the cool thing is people will be able to decide what tools they want and what tools they don't want. So you're not going to be forced to use anything that you don't particularly want. At the moment, the search that they're supporting is Brave, but you could imagine that you could, put in DuckDuckGo search pretty easily, or Bing search, or something else if you wanted that. If you wanted to use a company a company database, you could put that in there as well.
It apparently opens up the model selection feature too, which is something that increasingly is going to happen with the agents, where you want to select the right model for the right case. Apparently, that was screenshotted and tweeted around, right, where a developer saw that was hidden in this protocol as well. So if that is now open sourced and freely available, then what happens to all those startups that have been raising money to do exactly this sort of thing, right? Eval and then model selection. Is this significant?
So I think the evals thing is a whole different thing, right? That's something different. But the model selection thing of what we call actually a model router, that's something that all the big proprietary companies are basically incorporating at the moment. So you're going to see that next year probably that rather than a sort of organization constantly picking, okay, we want this model, we want this model, you probably still be able to do that, but they'll probably have what they call like a smart API or something that'll look at whatever you sent them and decide, okay, for this one we just need the cheap model, or for this one we need the expensive model. So you're right, there are startups that have been doing that, probably going to be left out. That you can't unless they've got other sort of things that they're doing as well. I think the proprietary model companies are going to basically take over that space.
Got it. And so the big companies, they're actually using the technology to build AI applications. So, let's take Intuit, or Goldman Sachs, or a Walmart. They're going to be needing to route to the right model that they have from their own catalog, right? Or maybe from a cloud provider's catalog, like say Azure. But then you're saying on the other side, this is relevant because OpenAI is going to serve the model they think is most relevant for that case that Walmart is using. So who's going to do the controlling, and does this protocol impact that decision making?
So I think it's going to be something where the end user is going to be able to choose, right? Do they choose the smart API or the smart endpoint, which it chooses the best model for their prompt? Or do they just want the best model all the time? It's going to be a thing where a lot of people are going to want to save money. I think, the whole thing of people wanting to save money around this will definitely make these smart API endpoints, quite popular, because people are going to realize that, oh, okay, I only need that really big model for very few prompts that we're going to be putting in. Now, going back to what you just said quickly about the companies there, is that the companies themselves, though, they're going to be having like internal proxy systems, internal systems for doing that kind of thing. So they will still, those startups that have been doing routing will pivot to that kind of service. So yeah, I think that these things are definitely interesting. I Who knows, right? Like, we've got what, 5 weeks of the year left. We're expecting releases from OpenAI. We're expecting releases from Google. We're going to see, this whole thing that people have been talking about for the last month is, have we hit a wall, right? Have we hit this sort of, magical wall where it's much harder to get better? And my first instinct is say, yeah, in some ways we have hit a wall. But every time I kind of feel that, I see some of these open source companies come along and be able to make amazing models. So, the ball is certainly back in OpenAI's court. And it's going to be really interesting to see what do they release, and what does that, and how much better is that?
Sam, with these conversations, we're trying to target enterprise decision makers, the technical folks, product people, IT, data science professionals, people in charge of execution, building this stuff. I hope our viewers find it useful. If so, please click like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next chat next week.